Welcome back. Today, we're exploring the entire timeline of Don't Starve, a world shaped by curiosity and consequences. Let's begin. Long before Maxwell, before Wilson, before any human soul set foot in that peculiar dimension known as the constant, there existed a civilization. Not human, no. These were beings of chitin and purpose, arthropodal creatures whose hunched forms scuttled through caverns deep beneath what would one day become ruins. They were starving, always starving. Fear was their constant companion in those early days. Fear of the dark, fear of hunger, fear of the terrible emptiness that gnawed at them more persistently than any predator. They were weak, these ancient ones, scraping existence from stone and shadow in the depths below the surface world. But weakness, as history shows us time and again, breeds desperation. And desperation, well, desperation opens doors that perhaps should remain closed. It began, as many great tragedies do, with curiosity. The ancient civilization, those arthropodal beings whose chitinous forms hunched against the weight of survival, had existed for generations in the deep places beneath the surface. Theirs was not a proud history, not yet. They were scavengers in darkness, eking existence from fungal growths in the rare bounty of underground streams. When they dreamed of light, of warmth, of enough. The caves provided shelter, but little else. Food was scarce, competition fierce. The weak starved, the strong barely survived. Fear stalked them as surely as any predator, fear of the dark passages that twisted into unknown depths, fear of starvation that gnawed constantly at their bellies, fear of the terrible void that would claim them all eventually. In this desperate state, one exploration party ventured deeper than any before. Perhaps they sought new fungal beds. Perhaps they fled from some threat. The reason is lost to time. What matters is what they found. A chamber, vast beyond comprehension, carved by no natural process, and at its center, a gateway unlike any structure they'd encountered, tall as three of their kind standing, covered in symbols that seemed to writhe when observed directly, emanating an energy that made their mandibles click involuntarily. From this gateway, something leaked. A substance, a fluid, a presence. It pooled on the chamber floor, darker than any darkness they'd known. Yet it wasn't simply black, it was absence, void, given liquid form. Where it touched stone, the stone changed, became smoother, stronger, more. One brave or foolish explorer extended a chitinous limb, touched the substance. Power flooded through them. Not physical strength, though that came too. This was deeper. The ability to shape reality itself, to impose will upon the world, to make the universe bend and acknowledge and obey. The explorer pulled back, trembling, but the sensation lingered. The knowledge remained. They had found something that would change everything. The discovery was brought before their leader, the being history would know only as the ancient king. Unlike his subjects, the king possessed intellectual curiosity beyond mere survival. He studied the strange substance with the fervor of the desperate, made suddenly hopeful. What they found defied their limited understanding of the world. The substance responded to thought, to will, to desire. With it, they could shape stone as though it were clay, craft devices of impossible complexity, bend the very laws of their world to accommodate their needs rather than the other way around. They called it simply the fuel. And with the fuel came transformation. Within a single generation, or what passed for generations among their kind, the ancient civilization underwent changes that should have taken eons. They learned to cultivate the fuel, to draw more of it through the gateway, to refine and focus its properties. They built structures of breathtaking complexity. The ancient archive, a repository of knowledge carved into the living rock itself. Moonstones that drew down power from altar, the celestial being they worshipped. Gateways that connected distant chambers, that made the impossible possible. Their population grew. The starving became the satiated. The fearful became the bold. They expanded their domain, claiming chambers and caverns, building their civilization into something that might last, might endure, might finally escape the grinding poverty of mere survival. But there was another among them, one whose voice grew increasingly troubled as the years passed. Methius, advisor to the king, scholar of the highest order. Perhaps queen, though the ancient civilization's political structures remain mysterious. What is certain is this: Methius was present at the first discovery, carrying the torch that illuminated that fateful chamber. Methius was there when they brought the first fuel sample to the king. Methius witnessed every step of their civilization's transformation. And Methius noticed what others would not see. The fuel was changing them. Not just enabling them, changing them. Slowly at first, so gradually that it might be dismissed as imagination or paranoia. But Methius was neither imaginative nor paranoid. She was careful, observant, scientific in a way her people had never been before. The fuel granted them the capacity for such thought. She noticed how the king's mandibles twitched differently when he worked with the fuel, how his posture shifted, became more hunched, more aggressive, how his decisions grew bolder, yes, but also more cruel, more willing to sacrifice for the sake of progress. She noticed how workers exposed to the fuel for extended periods developed tremors, how their chitinous shells darkened, taking on a quality not unlike the fuel itself, how their eyes, once clear, developed shadows behind them. She noticed how the fuel pooled in certain chambers seemed to pulse in rhythm with something unseen, how it sometimes moved on its own, flowing uphill, defying the basic laws of matter, how it whispered, if you listened closely enough, in voices that spoke no language but communicated nonetheless. Methius began to investigate, quietly at first, not wanting to alarm the king or undermine the civilization's newfound prosperity. She studied the murals in the ancient archive, searching for precedents, for warnings, for any indication that their people had encountered something like this before. She found nothing. The fuel was new, unprecedented, unique in their history, which terrified her more than any confirmation of danger would have, because new things come from somewhere. And Methius was beginning to suspect where the fuel came from, or rather, whom it came from. They built wonders, oh yes, great archives filled with knowledge carved into stone, moonstones that drew power from the celestial eye that watched over their world, a being they called altar, gateways that connected distant places, spanned impossible distances. Their civilization flourished in ways they had never dared dream. But Methius noticed what others would not see, or could not see, or chose not to see. The fuel was changing them, not just their capabilities, their very essence. The king, once wise and measured, grew obsessed. The people became twisted, their forms shifting in ways both subtle and profound. The substance they had once called their salvation revealed its true nature. It was nightmare given form, shadow given substance. And they were watching. Who are they? Even now, countless years and countless victims later, that question remains shrouded in mystery. Beings of immense power, entities that exist beyond the comprehension of mortal minds. The ancients called them many names, but the truth of their nature remained elusive. What is known is this: they came to collect. The fuel, the nightmare fuel, as Methius renamed it in her final days, was never a gift. It was a lure, a hook baited with power, cast into the depths of reality to snare the desperate and the ambitious. And the ancient civilization had bitten hard. As they arrived to claim what was owed, the transformation accelerated. The ancient ones felt their bodies rebel, their minds fracture. They were becoming something else, something monstrous. Shadow creatures spawned in their midst, born from the very essence that had promised them salvation. Methius, watching her people fall, watching her king succumb to the corruption, made a choice. In the tales passed down through stone and shadow, she did the only thing that might stem the tide of darkness. She sacrificed herself. Some say she placed herself upon a throne, a device designed to channel and contain the nightmare energies. Others say she cast herself into the very heart of the Shadow Gateway. The details are lost to time, but the result remains. The advance of them was halted. The ancient civilization fell. Yes, their ruins scattered throughout the caverns and caves, their bodies transformed into the very shadow creatures they had unwittingly unleashed, their statues standing as silent testament to their hubris. But the constant itself survived, empty, silent, waiting. The gateways remained. The nightmare fuel continued to seep from places between places. And the nightmare throne, that terrible seat of power that had imprisoned the ancient king and witnessed Metheus' sacrifice, sat vacant in the depths, patient as stone, hungry as darkness, waiting for another fool to claim it, a man called William. The 26th of July, 1901, Liverpool, England. William Carter was, to put it charitably, a struggling stage performer. His tricks were adequate but uninspired. His patter was serviceable but forgettable. He was the sort of magician who might fill a small theater on a slow Tuesday, provided the ticket prices were reasonable and the competition scarce. But he had dreams, this William Carter. Dreams of grandeur, of spotlights and applause, of his name written in lights across the marquees of grand theaters. America, he reasoned, was the land of opportunity. Surely there his talents would find their proper appreciation. America, it turned out, had other ideas. By 1903, William Carter was not merely struggling, he was drowning. The debt accumulated like water in a sinking ship. Prop makers demanded payment. Landlords grew impatient. And there were others, shadowy figures with harder eyes and less patience still, who had extended credit at rates that compounded daily. His brother Jack reached out, a lifeline thrown from California, from a new life out west where the air was clean and the possibilities endless. "Come visit," Jack wrote. "The West is amazing. You'd love it here." William purchased a train ticket with money he didn't have. The circus and the shadow, the 23rd of August 1904. The Old Mill Crossing, somewhere in the American West. William Carter sat in the passenger car, the Codex Umbra heavy in his traveling bag, his thoughts a mixture of hope and apprehension. Jack's letter had been kind, but reading between the lines revealed concern. His little brother, struggling in New York, drowning in debt, running from creditors. "Come visit," the letter said. But what it meant was, come home before you destroy yourself completely. The train rattled along tracks that had seen too little maintenance. Outside the windows, the landscape had transformed from the cramped cities of the East into something vast and empty, beautiful in its desolation, terrifying in its indifference. William barely noticed. His attention was fixed on the book. He'd acquired it just weeks earlier, in a manner he couldn't quite remember clearly. Had he purchased it from a strange antiquarian, found it in a forgotten corner of a library, received it from a creditor as partial payment for a debt? The memory slipped away like water through fingers whenever he tried to grasp it. What mattered was the book itself. Even unopened, it emanated something. A presence, a promise. William could feel it through the canvas of his bag, a weight that wasn't entirely physical. Sometimes, late at night in his boarding house, he'd heard whispers from the bag. Not words, not quite, but suggestions, possibilities. He knew he should be afraid of it. Any rational person would be. But William Carter was desperate, and desperation erodes rationality like water erodes stone. The Abernethy and Parker circus wagon shouldn't have been at the crossing. Later investigations would reveal a series of small failures, a miscommunication between the circus master and the crossing guard, a broken signal lamp, a schedule that had been changed but not properly updated. Nothing criminal. Just the sort of casual chaos that occasionally erupts when multiple complex systems intersect. The train's engineer saw the wagon too late. He pulled the brake with all his strength, but momentum is a cruel master. Metal shrieked against metal. The whistle screamed. The world became noise and violence and the terrible mathematics of mass times velocity. William felt the impact more than heard it. The passenger car lurched, tilted, crashed against something solid. He was thrown from his seat struck his head against something hard, felt consciousness begin to slip away. Then came the secondary impacts as the cars piled into each other. Metal crushing metal, wood splintering, the ordered geometry of the train dissolving into chaos. When the world stopped moving, William found himself trapped. A section of the car had collapsed, pinning him from the waist down. He couldn't feel his legs, whether from injury or shock, he didn't know. Around him, other passengers screamed or moaned or lay ominously silent. Smoke rose from somewhere ahead, carrying the acrid smell of burning oil and something else, something organic that turned his stomach. This is how I die, William thought with curious detachment. Not on stage, not in glory. Crushed under a train in the middle of nowhere because I was too proud to admit defeat in New York. People were moving outside. He could hear voices shouting, organizing, trying to help. Someone was crying. Someone else was praying in a language he didn't recognize. Then he felt hands on the wreckage above him. Large hands, strong hands. Hold on, a voice called. Heavy accent. German, maybe. I will lift. The weight shifted slightly. The man outside, whoever he was trying to lift the collapsed section of the car. But it was too heavy, far too heavy for any human to move, no matter how strong. The hands strained, failed, tried again. William felt his consciousness beginning to fade. The blood loss, the shock, the sheer weight pressing down on him, it was too much. He was going to die here, and some stranger was going to die too, crushed by his own heroic effort to save someone who couldn't be saved. Then his bag split open. The Codex Umbra tumbled out, landing open to a page covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. And from those symbols, from the book itself, erupted tendrils of shadow. They were impossibly dark, these tendrils. Not merely black, but absence, the color of void, of spaces between stars, of the gaps in existence where reality simply stopped. They moved with fluid grace, wrapping around the collapsed car section with the casual strength of things that existed outside the normal rules of physics. The strong man outside Wolfgang, though William wouldn't learn his name for years, felt the weight suddenly lessen. The car section lifted as though it weighed nothing. He pulled William free with seconds to spare before the shadows released their grip and the wreckage crashed back down. William lay on the ground, bleeding, possibly dying, watching as the shadow tendrils retreated back into the codex. They moved like living things, like tentacles of some creature from depths beyond human ken. They paused before fully retracting, as though examining him, considering him, judging his worth. Then they vanished, and the book snapped shut. Wolfgang stared at the book, stared at William, opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again. What words could encompass what he'd just witnessed? Thank you, William managed. His voice sounded distant, thin. You saved my life. Wolfgang nodded slowly. It was not just me, he said, his accent thick with shock. Something else helped. Something. He gestured at the book, unable to articulate what he'd seen. William managed a weak smile. Magic, he whispered. It wasn't a lie. Not entirely. As the chaos of the accident consumed the crossing, doctors attending the injured, workers clearing the wreckage, authorities beginning their investigation, William slipped away. Not difficult, given the confusion. The newspaper would report one man missing, presumed dead. Let them presume. William Carter had died in that accident. What crawled away from the Old Mill Crossing was something else. He made his way to North Fork, Nevada, moving slowly, nursing injuries that should have killed him but somehow hadn't. The Codex Umbra remained in his possession. He didn't dare open it. Not yet. But he could feel it calling to him, promising him everything he'd ever wanted if only he had the courage to accept its gifts. In a small boarding house, paying with money he'd stolen from the accident site from the dead who no longer needed it, William Carter began to study in earnest. The symbols in the Codex were complex, built on principles that violated everything he knew about the world. Geometry that shouldn't work, mathematics that produced impossible results, incantations in languages that had never been spoken by human tongues. But William was nothing if not determined. He'd nearly died. had been saved by forces beyond his understanding, had been given, in effect, a second chance. He wasn't going to waste it. Night after night, he pored over the codex by lamplight, copied symbols onto paper, then onto the walls when paper proved insufficient, spoke the incantations quietly at first, then louder as his confidence grew. And slowly, gradually, the book began to reveal its secrets. The first successful summoning nearly killed him. He'd spent weeks preparing, gathering materials the codex specified, drawing the required geometric patterns on the floor of his room. The incantation itself took hours, words of power chained together in sequences that made his throat raw and his mind ache. Then, at the climax of the ritual, something answered. It manifested in the center of his circle, a being of pure shadow, formless and terrible. No face, no body in any traditional sense. Just a presence, a density of darkness that seemed to absorb all light and sound. It hung in the air before him, and William felt its attention settle on him like a physical weight. His fear was so great that he nearly lost control of the incantation, nearly broke the circle that was the only thing containing this entity. His hands shook. His voice cracked. The symbols on the walls seemed to writhe, trying to escape the confines of their chalk boundaries. But the thing made no hostile motions. It simply observed him, studied him with whatever passed for sight among its kind. And after a timeless moment, could have been seconds, could have been hours, it shivered and vanished, returning to whatever place it called home. William collapsed, gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs. He'd done it. He'd successfully summoned and controlled a being of pure nightmare. The theoretical magic in the codex was real, provably, undeniably real. And if one spell worked, why not others? Over the following months, William Carter died and Maxwell was born. The transformation wasn't merely one of names. William shed his old identity like a snake sheds skin. He stopped wearing his glasses, whether his vision had improved through the codex's influence or whether he simply felt they made him look weak is debatable. He adopted new mannerisms, new speech patterns, new ways of carrying himself. Gone was the desperate, struggling stage performer. In his place stood Maxwell the Great, confident, powerful, commanding, the kind of magician who didn't merely perform tricks, but demonstrated genuine power. He returned to performing, this time in San Francisco. But his act was different now. The shadows he summoned were real. The impossible feats he performed weren't illusions, but actual manipulations of reality. Audiences left his shows confused, amazed, convinced they'd witnessed something that shouldn't be possible. They weren't wrong. Maxwell became a sensation. Theaters fought for his bookings, newspapers wrote glowing reviews, people whispered that he might be the greatest magician of their generation. If only they'd known the truth. If only they'd understood that every performance was a summons, every trick a plea to forces that watched from the spaces between spaces. If only they'd realized that Maxwell wasn't in control. He was being controlled, guided, used as a tool by entities whose purposes remained inscrutable. But they didn't know, couldn't know, could only applaud and wonder and come back for more. In North Fork, Nevada, William Carter recovered from his injuries and discovered what he'd found. The Codex Umbra was no mere book of tricks. It was a grimoire of genuine power filled with symbols and incantations that reached into places between places, that drew on energies ancient and terrible. He sent a postcard to Jack, cryptic, excited, hinting at terrifying new possibilities. Then he vanished into his studies, deciphering the Codex's secrets with an obsession that would have worried anyone who knew him well. The symbols were challenging, the concepts alien to his educated but fundamentally mundane mind. But William Carter had always been persistent, and desperation had made him bold. He began to understand, to experiment, to summon. The first time he successfully performed one of the rituals, something answered. A being of shadow, formless and terrible, hung in the air before him. His fear nearly caused him to lose control of the incantation. nearly ended his life right there. But the creature simply observed him, hovering in the ether for a timeless moment before shivering out of existence. They were watching him now. He could feel it. The codex had opened a door, and things on the other side had taken notice. But knowledge is hard to unknow, and power, even terrible power, is intoxicating to those who've tasted powerlessness. William pressed on, growing bolder, more skilled. He no longer wore his glasses. Whether he no longer needed them or simply thought they made him look weak is unclear. He adopted a new name, one that spoke of confidence and command. Maxwell the Great. Charlie. The 6th of June, 1905. San Francisco. The Palace Hotel was where Maxwell conducted his business now. No more cheap boarding houses for him. His fame had brought money, and money had brought respectability. And respectability meant he could live like the success he'd always believed himself to be. The advertisement in the San Francisco Call was professional, carefully worded to attract the right type of candidate. Looking to hire a lady assistant for a magician's stage show. Previous experience, unnecessary, but should have a curious demeanor and a keen interest in the mysteries of the universe. Must provide own costume. He'd specified lady assistant because the shows required a certain elegance, a specific aesthetic. The magic was real, but presentation still mattered. People came to be entertained, not just amazed. They wanted spectacle with their supernatural. The responses came quickly. Fame attracted applicants, but most were unsuitable, too timid, too experienced, bringing expectations about how magic tricks should work, too focused on becoming famous themselves rather than contributing to the show. Then came Charlie. She arrived for her interview wearing a simple but well-maintained dress, her dark hair pinned up in the current fashion, a red rose tucked behind one ear. She moved with confidence but not arrogance. Curiosity evident in the way she observed everything in Maxwell's hotel suite, the books scattered across the desk, the symbols he'd hastily covered with cloth, the peculiar props that were more than props. Charlie, she introduced herself, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, her smile genuine. Just Charlie, if that's acceptable. I saw your advertisement, and I have to say, I'm intrigued. Intrigued? Maxwell found himself interested despite his intention to remain professionally distant. By what, specifically? By the mysteries of the universe, as you put it. Her eyes sparkled with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. I've always believed there's more to the world than what we can see and touch. More than what science has explained so far. Your shows. Well, I've attended 3 of them now, and either you're the greatest illusionist who ever lived, or you're actually doing something that shouldn't be possible. And which do you believe? Maxwell asked, curious despite himself. Charlie tilted her head, considering. Does it matter? Either way, it's remarkable. But if I'm being honest, she lowered her voice conspiratorially. I think it's real. I think you found something, some principle of reality that nobody else understands, and I'd very much like to be part of that. Maxwell hired her on the spot. What he didn't tell her, couldn't tell her, really was that the shadows had approved. During the entire interview, he'd felt their presence, invisible and observing. When Charlie smiled, they seemed to lean forward, interested. When she spoke of mysteries, they pulsed with what might have been excitement. They wanted her there. And Maxwell, prisoner to their will, more than he'd ever admit, gave them what they wanted. The partnership that developed exceeded Maxwell's expectations. Charlie took to the act immediately, understanding instinctively what was needed for each illusion. More than that, she seemed to sense when the shadows were active, when the magic was flowing, when Maxwell was channeling forces from beyond. She never asked him directly about it, never demanded explanations, but sometimes, late at night, after a particularly successful show, when they were reviewing the performance over coffee, she'd look at him with those knowing eyes and say things like, The shadows moved differently tonight, more responsive, like they were eager, or I felt something during the final trick, like we weren't alone on stage, like there were others watching from somewhere else. And Maxwell, against every instinct toward secrecy, found himself wanting to tell her, wanting to share the truth about the Codex Umbra, about the entities he'd contacted, about the terrible bargain he'd made when he chose to pursue this power. But he didn't, because keeping her ignorant kept her safe, or so he told himself. Their shows became legendary. Maxwell and Charlie performing feats that defied explanation. The shadows danced at his command, creating illusions so convincing that audiences left half convinced they'd witnessed actual sorcery. Charlie's presence seemed to enhance the effects. Somehow the shadows moved more fluidly when she was near, responded more reliably, created more impressive displays. Maxwell told himself it was just psychology. The audience responded better to a pair of performers. The dynamic between them created better showmanship. Nothing supernatural about it. But deep down, he knew the truth. They, the entities beyond, the watchers in the darkness, had chosen Charlie just as surely as they'd chosen him. She was part of whatever plan they were executing, part of the pattern being woven across reality. And Maxwell, despite his growing feelings for her, he tried not to acknowledge those feelings, tried to remain professional, but they grew nonetheless, was leading her directly into the trap. Charlie, for her part, seemed genuinely happy. Her letters to her sister Winona back east spoke of exciting work, a feeling like she was part of something important, of the thrill of performing before packed houses. She wrote about Maxwell too, his brilliance, his dedication to the craft, his mysterious nature that made him endlessly fascinating. What she didn't write about, perhaps because she didn't quite understand it herself, was the growing sense of something wrong. The way shadows in Maxwell's apartment seemed darker than they should be. The way she sometimes felt, watched, even when alone. The way her dreams had begun to feature impossible geometries and whispering voices in languages she didn't know. She attributed these things to stress, to excitement, to the natural consequences of performing such demanding shows night after night. After all, wasn't a little strangeness to be expected when you worked with the greatest magician of the age? If only she'd known how right she was, how much stranger things were about to become. The warning signs, April 1906. 3 days before the final performance, Charlie arrived at Maxwell's apartment to discuss the new finale they'd been planning. He'd been working on it for months, promising it would be the most spectacular trick anyone had ever seen, the culmination of everything he'd learned, everything he could do. He didn't answer her knock. Charlie waited, knocked again. Nothing. That was unusual. Maxwell was always punctual, always prepared. She tried the door and found it unlocked. "Maxwell," she called, entering the apartment. "Are you here? We need to go over the final preparations." The main room was empty, unusually so. Maxwell's books and papers, normally scattered in controlled chaos across his desk, had been cleared away. The props for their shows, the mirrors and cabinets and specialized implements stood unused in the corner. Then she noticed the fireplace. The false panel she'd never known was there had swung open, revealing a hidden room behind it. Light flickered from within, candlelight by the look of it. Every instinct told Charlie to leave, to not look, to respect Maxwell's privacy and come back later when he was available. But curiosity, that curious demeanor that had gotten her hired in the first place, drove her forward. The hidden room was small, windowless, suffocating in its intensity. Every wall was covered in symbols, crude scratching in chalk and charcoal, some drawn so deeply they'd scored the plaster beneath. She recognized some from the Codex Umbra Maxwell, kept it on his desk sometimes, though he never let her examine it closely. But others were new, desperate variations on themes she didn't understand. Words appeared again and again among the symbols. Enough. It's them. Charlie, her name. over and over, scrawled in increasingly frantic handwriting, surrounded by warnings and calculations and geometric patterns that seemed to riddle when she looked at them directly. In the center of the room, on a small table, sat the Codex Umbra. It was open to a page covered in symbols, more complex than any she'd seen before. Even from across the room, she could feel something emanating from it. A presence, a hunger. And beside the book sat a letter. Addressed to her, Charlie approached carefully, as one might approach a dangerous animal. The letter was in Maxwell's handwriting, but looser than his usual careful script. Almost frantic. Charlie, if you're reading this, I've either succeeded or failed in ways I can't yet predict. There's so much I should have told you. So much I kept hidden, thinking I was protecting you, protecting myself. The tricks are real. You were right about that. But they're not mine. They never were. I'm just a conductor, channeling power from somewhere else. From them. I don't know who. They are. Not really. The Codex hints at things, suggests possibilities, but never gives clear answers. What I do know is this. They've been using me, using us. Every show we perform, every shadow we summon, we're feeding them somehow, giving them something they need. The final trick is my attempt to end this, to prove I'm in control, not them, to demonstrate that I've mastered the shadows completely and can use this power on my own terms. But I'm afraid, Charlie. Terrified, if I'm being honest. I think they're tired of waiting. I think they want to collect what they're owed. And I think the final trick is going to give them exactly what they want. I try to cancel the show, try to stop, but I can't. The compulsion to perform, to complete what I've started, is overwhelming, like strings tied to my limbs, pulling me forward. If something goes wrong tomorrow night, if the trick fails, if something terrible happens, run. Don't try to help me, don't try to understand, just run as far and as fast as you can. I'm sorry I involved you in this. You deserve better than to be caught up in my ambition, my desperation, my damned prideful need to be important. The shadows are real, Charlie, and they're hungry. W.C. Charlie stood in that small, symbol-covered room, holding the letter, feeling the weight of revelation settle over her like a shroud. The shadows she'd thought were illusions. The magic she'd believed was clever stagecraft. All real, all dangerous. And tomorrow night, they were going to perform the final trick anyway, because Maxwell couldn't stop himself. Because something, some force, some entity, some presence beyond human understanding was pulling the strings. She should have run, should have packed her bags and taken the first train east, back to her sister, back to safety, back to a world where shadows were merely the absence of light and magic was children's entertainment. Instead, Charlie carefully folded the letter, placed it back on the table beside the codex, and left the hidden room. She closed the false panel carefully, leaving no sign she discovered Maxwell's secret. Because if Maxwell was trapped in something beyond his control, then leaving him to face it alone would be abandonment. And Charlie, whatever her flaws, was not the abandoning type. She would perform the final trick. She would stand beside Maxwell as shadows were summoned and impossible things manifested. She would face whatever came with the courage of someone who'd stared into the abyss and decided it didn't get to win without a fight. She would later reflect from the depths of her nightmare existence, probably the bravest and stupidest decision she'd ever made. The show, as they say, would go on. The final act, the 17th of April, 1906. San Francisco, the theater was packed, standing room only. Word had spread about Maxwell the Great's final performance, the culmination of his career, he'd promised. The trick to end all tricks, something never before seen on any stage, anywhere in the world. The audience hummed with anticipation. Critics sat in the front rows, notepads ready. Rival magicians lurked in the back, hoping to catch sight of the techniques Maxwell employed. Socialites filled the boxes, eager to witness history. Common folks pressed shoulder to shoulder in the cheaper seats, pooling their wages for the chance to see genuine magic. Nobody knew how right they were. Backstage, Charlie adjusted her costume one final time. The dress was new, commissioned specifically for this performance deep burgundy that looked almost black in certain lights, with silver accents that caught and reflected the stage lamps. Her dark hair was pinned up elaborately, and in it she wore a red rose, matching the one in Maxwell's lapel. She'd found the rose on her dressing table when she arrived, with a note in Maxwell's handwriting. For luck. W. No other message. No reference to the letter she'd found in his hidden room. No acknowledgement that tonight was anything other than another performance, albeit an important one. Charlie had spent the last 3 days wrestling with what she'd learned. Part of her wanted to confront Maxwell, demand the truth, insist they cancel the show and find some way to escape whatever trap he'd built around them. But another part, the curious part, the brave part, the part that had gotten her into this situation, wanted to see it through, wanted to know what happened when you challenge forces beyond human comprehension. Besides, Maxwell's letter had made it clear he couldn't stop. Something was compelling him forward, pulling him toward this moment like gravity pulling water downhill. If she abandoned him now, he'd face whatever came alone. And Charlie, as she'd established, was not the abandoning type. She found Maxwell in the wings, standing perfectly still, staring at the stage with an expression she couldn't read. His suit was immaculate as always, but something about his posture seemed off, tense, like a man waiting for execution. Maxwell, she said softly. He turned, and for just a moment, his mask slipped. She saw fear in his eyes, real, genuine terror. Then the showman's confidence reasserted itself, and he smiled. Charlie, you look stunning. Are you ready for this? Are you? She asked, holding his gaze. The smile faltered. No. But when has that ever stopped me? He reached into his jacket and produced a small object, a rose, dried and pressed, preserved with something that made it unnaturally resistant to decay. I want you to keep this. After tonight, regardless of what happens, I want you to have something to remember. Before. Before what? Before the magic stopped being just tricks, Maxwell said quietly. Before I ruined everything. Charlie took the rose, tucked it carefully into a hidden pocket of her costume. You haven't ruined anything yet. Haven't I? Maxwell laughed, but there was no humor in it. Charlie, if I could go back, if I could choose differently, I would have stayed a failed stage magician in New York, would have lived in poverty and died in obscurity. Anything would be better than what I brought down on both of us. Then cancel the show, Charlie said urgently. We'll leave, tonight. Take the first train east and never look back. I can't. And the way he said it, the finality, the absolute certainty, made it clear this wasn't reluctance or pride. It was literal truth. The Codex won't allow it. They won't allow it. I'm bound to this, Charlie. Bound like a puppet on strings. All I can do is go forward and hope. He trailed off, not finishing the thought. Hope what? Hope that when it's over, you remember that I tried to warn you, that I never wanted this, that if there'd been any other way. The stage manager appeared, signaling that it was time. Maxwell straightened, pulled his mask back into place. When he spoke again, his voice was steady, professional. Showtime. The curtain rose to thunderous applause. Maxwell walked onto the stage with the confidence of a man who owned the world. He acknowledged the audience with a slight bow, his smile perfect, his movements precisely choreographed. Charlie followed a step behind, moving with practiced grace, settling into her position near the elaborate prop cabinet they'd prepared for the finale. Ladies and gentlemen, Maxwell's voice carried to the back of the theater without shouting. Tonight, you will witness something unprecedented. Something that will challenge your understanding of what is possible. Something that will blur the line between illusion and reality, between the stage and the world beyond. He paused for effect. The audience leaned forward. Throughout my career, I have demonstrated feats that defy conventional explanation. But tonight, for my final performance, I will attempt something that has never been done before. I will reach into the Codex Umbra, he gestured, to the large tome resting on its pedestal. and draw forth a shadow made manifest. Not an illusion, not a trick, an actual being from beyond the veil, summoned and controlled by force of will alone. The critics scribbled frantically. The rival magicians leaned forward, trying to spot the mechanism. The common folk simply stared, caught up in Maxwell's presence, his voice, his absolute certainty. Charlie felt the temperature drop. Subtle, but noticeable. The shadows in the corners of the theater seemed to deepen, become more solid. The candles that provided ambient lighting flickered despite the lack of any draft. They were watching. She could feel them pressing against reality, eager for what came next. Maxwell approached the codex, his hand extended. I ask you to observe carefully. There are no mirrors, no hidden compartments, no concealed assistants. What you are about to witness is genuine sorcery, true magic, the power that has been lost to humanity for millennia and which I have reclaimed through years of study and sacrifice. His hand touched the cover of the codex. Even from across the stage, Charlie saw him flinch as if touching something burning hot. But he didn't pull back. Instead, he opened the book, turning to a specific page, the one covered in complex symbols, the one he'd spent months preparing for this moment. The page seemed to glow, or perhaps it was absorbing light rather than emitting it. The symbols writhed, rearranging themselves into configurations that hurt to look at directly. The shadow realm exists parallel to our own, Maxwell continued, his voice steady despite what must have been tremendous strain. Separated by barriers thin as gossamer, impenetrable as diamond. But with the right knowledge, the right tools, the right will, these barriers can be breached. Watch now as I demonstrate this truth. He plunged his hand into the codex, not metaphorically. His hand sank into the page as though the book were bottomless, as though paper and ink had become a gateway. His arm followed, then his shoulder. Maxwell leaning into the book with the intensity of a man fishing in deep water for something valuable. The audience gasped. This was beyond anything they'd seen before. No explanation presented itself, no obvious mechanism, no clear trickery. Maxwell's arm had simply vanished into a book that should have been solid. Then his expression changed. Charlie saw it immediately. The confidence cracked. Fear flashed across his face. He tried to pull back, his free hand grasping the pedestal for leverage. Something pulled back harder. No, Maxwell said, so quietly only Charlie and those in the first few rows could hear. Not yet. I'm not. I need to. The Codex Umbra moved on its own. Its pages fluttered as though caught in a wind that didn't exist, turning despite no hand touching them. They stopped on a different page, one Maxwell clearly hadn't intended, and from that page emerged hands. Massive, shadow solid, fingers like tree branches, palms wide as tabletops. They erupted from the codex with terrible grace, moving with purpose that suggested intelligence, awareness, hunger. They reached for Maxwell. He tried to dodge, tried to escape, but his arm was still caught in the book. The shadow hands wrapped around him, lifted him from the ground as though he weighed nothing. "Charlie, run!" Maxwell managed to shout. "Get out of!" The hands grabbed her too. She'd started moving the instant she saw Maxwell's fear, but the shadows were faster. They wrapped around her waist, her arms, lifting her as they'd lifted Maxwell. She felt them cold beyond any cold she'd known, solid yet somehow insubstantial, real yet impossible. The audience screamed. Some fled for the exits. Others remained frozen, unable to process what they were witnessing. The critics dropped their notepads. The rival magicians scrambled backwards, tripping over seats in their haste to escape. Maxwell struggled against the shadow hands, but they were irresistible. They pulled him toward the codex, toward the page that had become a portal, toward whatever waited beyond. "I'm sorry," he shouted to Charlie, to the audience, to the world. "I thought I could control it. I thought..." The shadows swung them both, violent and fast. like a child playing with dolls. Charlie felt bones creak under the force, felt her consciousness start to dim from the whiplash effect, saw the theater spinning around her, the chandelier, the balconies, the fleeing crowd, all blurring together. Then the world tore open. Later, seismologists would record a massive earthquake, 5 on the Richter scale, epicenter in San Francisco. It would cause tremendous damage to the city, killing hundreds, leaving thousands homeless. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake would be remembered as one of the worst natural disasters in American history. But those in the theater that night knew the truth. It wasn't an earthquake. It was reality breaking. Dimensions colliding, the barriers between worlds rupturing as the Codex Umbra served its true purpose, not as a tool for Maxwell's use, but as a gateway for them to collect what they were owed. Maxwell and Charlie fell through the breach, through the spaces between spaces, through layers of reality that the human mind wasn't designed to perceive. They screamed, though whether sound actually emerged is debatable. They reached for each other, though distance and direction lost meaning in the transition. The last thing Charlie saw before consciousness fled was Maxwell's face, twisted in anguish and regret. The last thing she heard was his voice, barely audible over the roar of dimensional collapse. "Forgive me." Then darkness claimed them both. The Codex Umbra, its purpose fulfilled, snapped shut. The shadow hands retracted. The tear in reality sealed itself, leaving no trace of its existence except for the trembling earth and the witnesses who would never quite be able to explain what they'd seen. In the aftermath, amidst the chaos of the earthquake, theater officials would find no trace of Maxwell or Charlie. No bodies, no clothing, nothing. It was as if they'd never existed. The Codex Umbra was discovered on its pedestal, undamaged by the quake. It would be cataloged, stored, eventually lost in the confusion of the earthquake's aftermath. Years later, it might resurface in an antique shop, or a library's special collection, or the attic of some collector who didn't realize what they possessed, waiting for the next fool who thought they could master forces beyond human comprehension. Maxwell awoke alone. The landscape around him was impossible, familiar enough to almost be Earth, alien enough to be clearly something else. Trees grew in strange formations. The grass had a peculiar sheen to it, and in the distance, structures that seemed ancient and wrong jutted from the earth like broken teeth. But Maxwell barely noticed the landscape. His attention was drawn to the structure before him, a throne of nightmare, all sharp angles and malevolent purpose. It called to him, that throne, promised him power, offered him control. And wasn't control what he'd always wanted? Hadn't that been the whole point? To command the shadows? To bend reality to his will? To never again be the struggling failure, drowning in debt and disappointment? He sat. The throne welcomed him, accepted him, trapped him. Suddenly, Maxwell understood. The Codex had never been his to command. He'd been its puppet all along, dancing through steps choreographed long ago by entities whose plans spanned centuries. The ancient civilization had learned this lesson too late. Now, it was his turn. But the throne granted compensations for its prison. Maxwell found he could shape the constant, could create creatures and structures, could pull people from the real world into this shadow realm. Not through his own power, never that. He was merely a conduit, a prisoner granted certain privileges by his jailers. And Charlie? Charlie was nowhere to be found, at least not the Charlie he'd known. Instead, when darkness fell completely, when every light source failed, something attacked, something with terrible strength and speed, something that had once been human. The night monster had been born. Time passes strangely in the constant. Days blend into years, blend into decades, or perhaps mere moments. Maxwell, bound to his throne, began to understand the scope of his prison. He could not leave the throne for long, could not escape the constant, could not die, at least not permanently. For death here simply meant resurrection, an endless cycle of suffering. His only company was the Codex Umbra and the shadow creatures that served them. So Maxwell did what prisoners do. He adapted, he created, he experimented. The constant was empty, a blank canvas awaiting an artist. Using his limited control, Maxwell shaped it into a twisted reflection of the world he'd left behind. He populated it with creatures both whimsical and terrible, beefalo that roamed the grasslands, pig people that built little villages, spiders and hounds, and things that defied easy categorization. He built monuments to himself, statues scattered across the landscape, chess-themed structures that served no purpose but to remind any who might find them that this was Maxwell's domain. Pride, perhaps, or maybe just loneliness given form. And he waited. The constant needed something, needed people. Whether this was Maxwell's own twisted desire for company or a requirement imposed by them is unclear, perhaps both. Either way, Maxwell began to reach back into the real world, seeking souls to populate his prison. He needed bait. Luckily, he knew exactly what to use. Wilson, Sydney, Ohio. The Voxola Radio Company was established with grand ambitions. Revolutionary technology, they promised. Sound quality unlike anything the world had ever heard. Reception so clear you could hear a pin drop in the broadcast studio from your living room 1,000 miles away. Robert Wagstaff, the company's founder, was a brilliant inventor whose understanding of electromagnetic waves bordered on the supernatural. He built radios that shouldn't work according to contemporary physics. Radios that seemed to pull signals from places beyond normal broadcast range. Radios that, if you listened very carefully on certain frequencies, transmitted things that weren't quite voice and weren't quite static, but something in between. The factory produced perhaps a dozen PR, 76 models before it burned. The fire was catastrophic, consuming the building and all the production equipment in a matter of hours. Robert Wagstaff disappeared that same night, presumed dead in the flames, though no body was ever found. The handful of radios that survived became collector's items, curiosities. Most ended up in storage, in estate sales, in the hands of people who didn't realize what they owned. One found its way to Wilson P. Higsbury. Wilson was, by any objective measure, a failure. Not for lack of intelligence, his mind was sharp, his grasp of scientific principles solid, his experimental methodology sound, but intelligence alone doesn't guarantee success. Luck plays a role. Timing, the ability to politic within academic circles, the willingness to compromise one's vision for funding. Wilson possessed none of these secondary skills. He was stubbornly independent, convinced his ideas were sound despite consistent experimental failures. He alienated potential sponsors with his refusal to modify his theories to suit their preferences. He worked alone in a laboratory deep in the New England mountains, isolated from peers who might have offered guidance or caught the flaws in his reasoning before they manifested as failed experiments. By 1921, he was desperate. His funding had evaporated. His peers dismissed his work. His experiments failed with monotonous regularity. He was approaching the age where starting over in a new field might still be possible, but each passing day made that option less viable. On a dark and stormy night, and yes, it really was dark and really was stormy, because the universe apparently has a taste for cliche, Wilson hunched over his latest experiment, another failure. The chemical compounds refused to combine properly. The expected reaction didn't occur. 6 months of work had produced nothing but confirmation that his approach was, once again, incorrect. Thunder rumbled outside. Rain lashed against the windows. Wilson sat in his chair, staring at the failed experiment, wondering if it was time to give up, to admit defeat, to find work as a teacher, perhaps in some small college, where his publications would be respected, even if his experimental work was not. That's when the radio spoke to him. It shouldn't have been on. Wilson distinctly remembered switching it off hours earlier, but there it sat on his desk, the vacuum tubes glowing orange in the dim laboratory light, sound crackling from the speaker. Except it wasn't music, wasn't a broadcast. wasn't even static. It was a voice. Having trouble, are we? The voice was cultured, faintly amused, masculine, British accent maybe. Such a shame when our experiments fail, when our theories collapse under the weight of reality's indifference. Wilson stared at the radio. Who is this? How are you? How am I speaking to you? The voice chuckled. Through your radio, obviously. Really, for a scientist, you ask rather pedestrian questions. The radio wasn't on. I turned it off. Did you? How certain are you of that? Memory is such a tricky thing. Perhaps you forgot. Perhaps I turned it on. Perhaps the distinction between on and off is less binary than you believe. A pause. But we're wasting time. You have a problem. I have a solution. Interested? Wilson's rational mind screamed warnings. Unknown voices through radios. Impossible broadcasts. This was clearly a prank or hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. He should turn off the radio properly, turn it off, unplug it even, and get some sleep. Instead, he heard himself ask, what solution? Secret knowledge. The voice was pleased now, triumphant even. Knowledge that your peers don't possess. Knowledge that will make your experiments succeed. Make your theories provable. Make you important. Respected. Remembered. There's no such thing as secret knowledge, Wilson said, trying to inject some academic rigor into this surreal conversation. Either something is known or it isn't. Either it's been published or published. The voice laughed. Oh, my dear fellow. You think knowledge only exists if it's in your journals? If it's been peer-reviewed and properly cited? How adorably naive. Wilson felt anger rising. Who are you to call me? I am the person offering you what you want. The voice cut him off smoothly. The question isn't who I am. The question is, are you ready for this? Because secret knowledge comes with responsibilities, with consequences. Once you know certain things, you can't unknow them. Once you cross certain thresholds, there's no going back to comfortable ignorance. I'm a scientist, Wilson said stiffly. I'm not afraid of knowledge. Are you not? The voice sounded thoughtful. We'll see. Very well. Listen carefully. The instructions that followed were precise and specific. A machine, not large, not requiring exotic materials, but configured in ways that violated conventional understanding of how such devices should work. Components arranged in geometries that seemed wrong, that hurt to visualize properly. Connections that shouldn't carry current, but somehow did. Wilson sketched as the voice spoke, his hands moving almost automatically. Scientific training making him record every detail, even as his rational mind rebelled against the impossibility of what he was hearing. The voice finished. There. You have what you need. Build it. Activate it. And we'll see what happens next. Think of it as an experiment. You like experiments, don't you, Wilson? How do you know my? The radio went silent, properly silent, the vacuum tubes dimming, the speaker offering nothing but the faint hiss of dead air. Wilson sat alone in his laboratory, storm raging outside, a schematic for an impossible machine spread across his desk. He should burn it, should throw the papers into the fireplace and forget this had ever happened. Instead, he began gathering materials. 3 days later, working with barely any sleep, sustained by coffee and the manic energy of a man who knows he's doing something momentous, possibly monstrously stupid, but definitely momentous, Wilson completed the machine. It looked wrong. Even to his eyes, educated in physics and engineering, the device seemed to violate basic principles. Components that shouldn't interact did. Wires ran in patterns that made no geometric sense. The whole contraption seemed to hum with potential energy even before he activated it. Wilson checked his connections one final time, verified that yes, he'd followed the instructions exactly, verified that no, this shouldn't work according to any scientific principles he understood. Then he threw the switch. The machine didn't roar to life so much as tear reality. Space folded, light bent. The air in the laboratory seemed to compress and then expand, like the room itself was breathing. And at the center of it all, a portal opened a tear in the fabric of existence, swirling with colors that shouldn't exist and shapes that hurt to perceive. Wilson had one moment to realize his mistake. One instant of clarity where he understood that the voice on the radio hadn't been offering help, it had been offering a trap. Then the portal's pull became irresistible, and Wilson was yanked from his laboratory into somewhere else entirely. The transition was violent. Colors streamed past at impossible speeds. Sound became visual, visual became tactile, tactile became thoughts that weren't his own. Wilson felt himself being torn apart and reassembled, unmade and remade, scattered across the gaps between realities, and then compressed back into something approximating human form. When he finally landed, sprawling onto grass that felt almost but not quite right, the portal snapped closed behind him. Wilson lay there, gasping, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. When he finally managed to sit up, he found himself in a landscape that was familiar and alien in equal measure. Trees, but wrong trees. Evergreens that were too regular, too geometric. Grass, but grass that seemed to have a faint luminescence in the fading light. A boulder that had veins running through it, like circuitry. And in the distance, structures that might have been made by human hands, but seemed off in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Then came the voice. The same voice from the radio, but stronger now, more present. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, accompanied by the materialization of a figure tall, dapper, wearing a suit that was too perfect to be real. Maxwell. "Say, pal," Maxwell said, his smile sharp as broken glass. "You don't look so good. You better find something to eat before night comes." Wilson stared at the figure, at the impossible landscape, at his own hands, still trembling from the transition. "Where am I? What have you done?" "Done?" Maxwell laughed. "I've given you exactly what you wanted. An experiment, a test, a chance to prove how brilliant you really are." He leaned closer, and Wilson could see that his eyes were wrong, too dark, too deep, like looking into wells that had no bottom. "Welcome to the constant, Wilson. Try not to die too quickly. It's so much more interesting when you last a while." Then Maxwell vanished in a swirl of shadow, leaving Wilson alone in the gathering darkness, with no supplies, no plan, and the slowly dawning realization that he'd made a terrible, terrible mistake. Somewhere in the woods, something howled. It didn't sound like any animal Wilson had ever heard. And as the sun set with unnatural speed too fast, the transition from day to night occurring in minutes rather than hours, Wilson understood that his first priority wasn't understanding where he was or how to get home. His first priority was surviving the night. And so began Wilson's time in the constant. Days bleeding into weeks, bleeding into months, bleeding into years, time moved strangely here, making it hard to keep track. He died his first night, torn apart by creatures that manifested from the darkness itself. But death wasn't the end. He woke again at a strange stone structure he'd glimpsed during his initial exploration, resurrected by forces he didn't understand. He learned, adapted, survived. Learned to gather resources before night fell. Learned which creatures could be avoided and which had to be fought. Learned to build campfires and eventually science machines and alchemy engines. Learned that going insane brought its own problems, shadow creatures that attacked not just his body but his mind. Learned that Maxwell appeared occasionally, always mocking, always watching. Learned that other survivors had been here before him, the skeletons scattered across the landscape, the abandoned campsites, the signs of civilizations that had risen and fallen in this pocket dimension. Learned, most importantly, that the constant was a prison, and Maxwell was its warden. An escape seemed impossible until he found Maxwell's door. The others. They came one by one, or in small groups, each drawn by their own desire, each lured by what they wanted most. Willow, the pyromaniac, was given a lighter that could burn forever. She used it to torch the Voxola factory. earning Maxwell's ire. But by then, it was too late. She was marked, and into the constant she went. Wolfgang, the strong man from the circus, yes, the same man who'd helped save William Carter all those years ago, was promised strength beyond any mortal. He awoke in the constant, finding that his wishes had been granted in the cruelest way possible. He had great strength, but only when well fed and brave. Starve or falter, and he became weak as a child. Wendy, Maxwell's own niece, came seeking her dead twin sister Abigail. Maxwell, in perhaps his only gesture of something resembling compassion, gave her the means to summon Abigail's ghost, but Wendy too was pulled into the constant, her pale features and morbid observations a constant reminder to Maxwell of the family he'd left behind. WX-78, the robot, may have been Maxwell's own creation, an attempt to build a mechanical servant that backfired spectacularly. Or perhaps it was another victim, a construct that gained sentience and found itself imprisoned in this realm. Either way, it came to hate its presumed maker with a cold fury that only a machine can maintain. Wickerbottom, the librarian, Maxwell's own mother, some whispered, though the truth was never quite clear, found herself pulled into the constant with her vast knowledge intact, but her mortality very much a concern. Woody, the Canadian lumberjack, cursed with lycanthropy of a peculiar sort, carried an axe named Lucy. Or was Lucy his wife, transformed by tragedy and Maxwell's dark magic into the form of an axe? The stories contradicted each other, as stories often do when filtered through madness and trauma. Wes, the mime, had displeased Maxwell somehow. Perhaps his silence irritated the puppet master, or perhaps he'd simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Regardless, he found himself in the constant, unable to speak, barely able to survive. And so it went. Each victim brought their own story, their own tragedy, their own desperate hope. Each one died and died and died again, resurrecting at strange touchstones scattered across the landscape, or at meat effigies they'd crafted in preparation for inevitable death. Maxwell watched them struggle. Sometimes he taunted them, sometimes he remained silent. But always, he watched. Because what else was there to do when you're trapped on a throne at the end of the world, the season's turn? The constant had its own rhythms, its own terrible logic. The survivors who lasted long enough learned to recognize the patterns. Summer came with withering heat that could ignite flammable objects and cook the unprepared in their own skin. Autumn brought a false sense of security, mild weather that lulled the unwary into complacency. Winter arrived with killing cold and shortened days, testing whether one had gathered enough supplies to endure. Spring, oh, spring was perhaps worst of all, bringing rains that drenched and drove one to madness, along with creatures emerging from winter's sleep, hungry and aggressive. And through it all, the nights, those terrible nights when the darkness became absolute and Charlie the night monster, the thing that had once been Maxwell's assistant, prowled invisible in the black, attacking any who failed to maintain their light sources. The survivors adapted or died. They learned to fear the depths of the caves where the nightmare cycle pulsed like a malevolent heartbeat. They learned to respect the ancient structures they found, ruins of the civilization that had fallen before humanity ever knew this place existed. They learned that death was not an ending, but merely an interruption, a temporary setback in their eternal struggle. Some went mad. The shadow creatures that spawned when sanity crumbled saw to that. Others grew hard, became veterans of impossible survival. A few even thrived in their way, but none escaped. Maxwell had seen to that. The constant was sealed, a pocket dimension with no exit, or so they all believed. Wilson found the door quite by accident. It stood alone in a clearing, ornate and impossible. Maxwell's door, though it bore no nameplate. It called to those who survived long enough, those who'd mastered the basics of existence in the constant. Stepping through meant leaving everything behind, all your carefully gathered resources, all your established bases, everything you'd built. You could take 4 items with you, nothing more. It was madness to even consider it. Wilson stepped through, The worlds beyond the door were Maxwell's playgrounds, his experiments, his tests. 5 increasingly difficult challenges, each one a twisted version of the constant. Worlds plunged into permanent winter. Worlds lit perpetually by summer sun. Worlds shrouded in darkness. Worlds filled with the magical king's chess piece constructs, those terrible clockwork knights and bishops and rooks that attacked on sight. Wilson persevered. Through cold and heat and darkness and dawn, through starvation and madness and death after death after death, he pressed forward. Because somewhere in his brilliant, stubborn mind, he understood that Maxwell was the key. That reaching Maxwell meant possibly ending this nightmare. The final challenge was simpler than he'd expected. A narrow corridor, unnaturally straight, cutting through a landscape. No tricks, no elaborate survival challenges, just a straight path to Maxwell's throne. Wilson walked it, his remaining supplies clutched close, his beard grown long from his journey, his eyes haunted but determined. At the end of the corridor stood the throne room, and on the throne sat Maxwell, exactly as Wilson had seen him all those times before, dapper suit, sardonic smile, entirely trapped. Maxwell spoke then, not taunts, not mockery. For the first time since Wilson had arrived in the Constant, Maxwell spoke truth. "They've got us all trapped," he said. The weariness in his voice was palpable. "I can't leave this throne. You can't leave this world. There's no escape. Don't you think I've tried?" Wilson approached the throne, examined the device that held it in place. A divining rod was needed, a thing he learned to craft in his long months of survival. He brought one with him through the worlds. "I tried to tell you," Maxwell continued, almost pleading now. "The throne won't allow violence. I've tried everything. There's no escape. We're here forever. You, me, all of them, forever." But Wilson wasn't trying to destroy the throne. He was trying to open it. The lock released. Maxwell's eyes widened, surprise, hope, relief, all flashing across his face in quick succession. The bindings released. For the first time in decades, or had it been centuries, Maxwell stood from the nightmare throne. He stretched, took a step, began to smile. Then he began to crumble. His body withered, collapsing in on itself, turning to ancient bones and then to dust that scattered in a wind that didn't exist. Maxwell's last expression wasn't fear. It was something almost like gratitude. Wilson had only a moment to wonder if he'd done the right thing before massive shadow hands erupted from the ground beneath him. They grabbed him with irresistible force, dragged him down despite his struggles. When they released him, he was on the throne. The spikes drove into him. The binding took hold. And Wilson understood, far too late, what he'd done. He hadn't freed Maxwell. He'd merely traded places with him. The gramophone beside the throne began to play music, tinny and cheerful and absolutely horrifying in context. The screen of Wilson's perception faded to black, and so the cycle continued. Wilson sat on the nightmare throne for how long? Time moved differently for the throne's occupant. Could have been days, could have been years, could have been minutes that felt like eternities. He tried everything Maxwell had tried. Tried to stand, the throne wouldn't allow it. Tried to use the wooden thing he discovered nearby. It simply teleported him back to the throne. Tried to summon help. No one could hear. Tried to die. Death didn't take. The throne was patient. It had held the ancient king. It had held Maxwell. Now it held Wilson. It would hold whoever came next. That was its purpose. That was its curse. Until she came, Charlie arrived in her human form, or something approximating it. The form she'd worn in life before the Codex Umbra had dragged her into the Constant and transformed her into the night monster. She approached the throne, and for a moment, Wilson dared to hope. She reached for the bindings. Wilson felt them loosen. The release was euphoric. He was free! Free! Then Charlie's other self emerged. The night monster, the terrible shadow thing that hunted in the dark, surged forth. The two aspects of Charlie warred for control, human versus monster, compassion versus hunger. The struggle was brief, the monster won. Charlie's shadow form lashed out, striking Wilson with tremendous force, sending him tumbling away from the throne into a portal that appeared beneath him. He fell through, away from the throne room, back into the world proper. When he landed, bruised and battered, but alive and blessedly free of the throne, he found Maxwell waiting for him. Maxwell, restored to life by the same twisted rules that govern death in the constant. Maxwell, no longer the dapper puppet master, but just another survivor, his power stripped away, his control gone. Maxwell, looking as shocked as Wilson felt. For a moment, they stared at each other, victim and victimizer. The one who'd been trapped and the one who'd done the trapping. Then, because survival in the constant requires pragmatism above all else, they began to talk. The jury-rigged portal, Maxwell knew things. That much became clear quickly. He knew the layout of the constant in ways none of the other survivors did, knew where resources could be found, knew the patterns of the seasons and the behaviors of the creatures, knew, most importantly, about the nature of their prison. Charlie was on the throne now. Charlie transformed into something that was neither quite human nor quite monster, but some terrible fusion of both. She had taken control of the constant, but she was different. Not as cruel as Maxwell had been, not as interested in tormenting the survivors, but also not interested in letting them leave. Wilson and Maxwell found common ground in a simple truth. They needed help. The other survivors were scattered across the constant, each in their own version of this twisted dimension, separated and alone. If they could bring everyone together, the device they built was a testament to desperation and ingenuity. Wilson provided the scientific knowledge. Maxwell provided understanding of the constant's magical properties. Together, they crafted the jury-rigged portal, a machine that could theoretically pull survivors from their separate dimensions and unite them in one place. They called it the florid postern, for lack of a better name. When they activated it, reality bent. Wendy emerged first, ghostly Abigail trailing behind her. Then Wes, silent as always, but clearly relieved. Wolfgang stumbled through, immediately looking around for threats. The portal was working. Then Charlie arrived. She didn't attack, didn't destroy them. Instead, she did something far more unsettling. She improved their device. Her shadow form reached into the portal's mechanisms, twisting and modifying, adding her own understanding of the constant structure. When she finished, the jury-rigged portal had transformed into something more stable, more powerful. The floored postern began to properly function. Survivors poured through, Willow with her lighter, WX-78, proclaiming its hatred for all fleshlings. Wickerbottom, already cataloging the strange flora around her. Woody and Lucy arguing about something in their peculiar way. They were together now. For the first time since being pulled into the constant, the survivors could actually work as a group, could pool their knowledge and resources. It changed everything. The ruins. Emboldened by their numbers, the survivors began to explore more boldly. The caves had always been there, dark entrances leading down into nightmare depths. Now, working together, they delved deeper than any individual had dared. What they found staggered them. The ruins of the ancient civilization sprawled through the caverns, massive structures of unfamiliar architecture, broken machinery that still hummed with power, murals depicting the rise and fall of beings that had come before. This place had been inhabited once, had been a center of great power and learning, had been destroyed by the very same forces that now imprisoned the survivors. Wickerbottom studied the murals with intense fascination. The story they told was incomplete but suggestive. A civilization of insectoid beings, their discovery of nightmare fuel, their rise to greatness, their transformation and fall. The images showed a figure that might have been their leader, seated on a throne not unlike the one Maxwell had occupied. Showed another figure, Methius. The name appeared in ancient script standing before the corruption, torch held high in defiance. The ruins told a story the survivors understood all too well. They were not the first to be trapped here, merely the latest. In the deepest part of the ruins, past the broken clockwork guardians that still defended their long-dead masters, past the nightmare-infected depths where sanity drained away like water through a sieve, they found the atrium. An enormous chamber, clearly designed for some great purpose. At its center stood a gateway unlike any they'd seen before. The ancient gateway, taller than 3 men, carved with symbols that hurt to look at too long. And scattered around it, bones. Many bones. The last remains of the ancient civilization, preserved in death, their forms twisted into shapes that suggested their transformation had been complete when the end came. Maxwell examined the gateway carefully. "This connects to something," he said quietly. "Or maybe someone. The ancients built it for a reason. But what reason? And did the survivors really want to find out?" The ancient fuel weaver. The answer came when someone, history doesn't record who, though many claimed credit afterward, decided to experiment. The bones in the atrium could be assembled. With enough effort and the right components, they could be made whole. And with the ancient gateway activated, the ancient fuel weaver rose. It was massive, this thing. A skeleton giant, animated by the same nightmare energy that had destroyed the civilization it once belonged to. Its very presence drained sanity from those nearby. Its attacks could cage survivors in bone, could summon smaller shadow creatures to aid it, could heal itself by consuming the nightmare weavings that spawned from the ground. The battle was legendary. Multiple survivors working in concert, utilizing every trick and tactic they'd learned in their time in the Constant. Weapons forged from nightmare fuel and thulecite. Armor crafted from ancient alloys. Magic and science working in tandem. When the fuel weaver finally fell, it spoke. Just a few words, directed at no one in particular. Methius. Then it collapsed, and the gateway began to destabilize. The ancient key was consumed. Shadow creatures in the area died en masse. And slowly, inexorably, the ruins began to regenerate, resources respawning, structure repairing themselves. But something else had happened. As the survivors caught their breath and tended their wounds, a hand appeared in the atrium. Not threatening, simply beckoning. It wanted something. 5 pieces of dreadstone, a material infused with nightmare energy. When provided, the hand vanished. And somewhere in the Constant, reality shifted. Shadow rifts began to open in the caves, spilling forth creatures and challenges the survivors had never encountered before. Charlie's influence at work, perhaps. Or them, using the survivors as tools to reshape the Constant according to some inscrutable plan. Either way, the survivors had learned something crucial. The Constant could be changed, challenged, perhaps even escaped, given enough knowledge and enough determination. The question was, did they dare try? The Forge. The answer came through the gateway. After the Fuel Weaver's defeat, after the ruins had regenerated, some survivors noticed the ancient gateway had changed. It remained stable longer, and stranger still, it seemed to call to them, beckoning them forward. Against all better judgment, a group decided to investigate. They stepped through the gateway and found themselves somewhere else entirely. The Forge was a realm of stone and fire, cut off from the Constant proper. Here, pig-like warriors trained and fought, led by a being called the Battlemaster Pugna. When the survivors emerged, these warriors challenged them immediately, but not to the death, to combat, yes, brutal, intense combat, but structured, almost ritualistic. Pugna spoke of the throne, claimed the survivors served it, demanded to know why they had been severed from it, trapped in this realm without the power it once provided. The survivors, confused, could only fight. Round after round, they battled the Battlemaster and his champions. The combat was fierce, but strangely honorable. When the survivors finally emerged victorious, Pugna yielded. "The day is yours, as is the gateway," he announced. The survivors, battered but triumphant, stepped through another portal that appeared. They didn't return to the constant. Instead, they found themselves in the Gorge. A dying world greeted them, islands scattered across a polluted sea. A city that had clearly once been grand, now fallen into ruin and disease. And everywhere, the signs of a plague that transformed the living into twisted fish people. In the center of this dying realm sat the eternal Na, a massive beast whose hunger could never be satisfied. The survivors learned quickly this place operated on different rules. Here, they were not fighters, but servants. They had to gather ingredients, cook elaborate dishes, offer them to the Na to appease its endless appetite. The pig and goat inhabitants of this place were desperate. Their civilization was collapsing, claimed by plague and the Na's insatiable hunger. But the arrival of the survivors offered hope. New cooks, new recipes, perhaps enough to finally satisfy the beast. The survivors worked furiously, farming, fishing, gathering exotic ingredients from across the islands, combining them in specific ways to create dishes that earned the Na's favor, if only temporarily. It was exhausting, thankless work. But it was also, strangely, a reprieve from the constant death struggle of the constant. Eventually, they succeeded, earned enough of the Na's approval that it opened a portal home. The survivors stepped through, leaving the dying realm behind, but carrying with them new knowledge, new questions. Why had these realms been connected to the constant? What was them's purpose in creating these pocket dimensions, these trials? And most importantly, if the ancient gateway connected to the forge, and the forge connected to the gorge, what other places might be accessible through similar means? The survivors had glimpsed something larger than they'd imagined. The constant was not isolated. It was part of a network, a web of connected dimensions, all somehow under the influence of them. And somewhere, sitting on the nightmare throne, Charlie was learning, growing stronger, preparing for something. The moon falls. It started as a pinprick of light in the sky, wrong in a way that defied easy description. The survivors of the constant had grown accustomed to impossibility, but this was different. This light felt hungry, watchful, ancient. Then it grew. The light became a mass, the mass became visible, and then one night, it fell. The impact sent shockwaves across the constant. A chunk of the moon, or what they'd always believed was the moon, had crashed into the ocean, creating a new landmass on the coast. The survivors naturally investigated. The lunar island was wrong in fundamental ways. The plants there didn't follow normal botanical rules. Creatures spawned from pure moonlight, chittering and hostile and utterly alien. And everywhere, an aura of lunacy that eroded sanity in ways different from the nightmare fuel's influence. This wasn't the dark madness of shadow. This was bright madness. Clarity turned so sharp, it cut. Wilson, Winona, and Wigfrid built a boat, the first proper sailing vessel constructed in the constant. They navigated to the island, and what they discovered changed everything. The moon wasn't a moon at all. Or rather, it was, but not in any traditional sense. Under the surface, they found cave networks filled with structures that predated even the ancient civilization's ruins. Glyphs that Wickerbottom dated to before the bug people's discovery of nightmare fuel. These were old, impossibly old, and they depicted alter the being the ancients had worshipped, the eye in the sky. The Watcher, Maxwell, examining the evidence, felt the foundations of his understanding crack. "I thought I knew about them," he muttered. "I thought I understood this place. But this predates everything. They were here before the ancients, before the constant took its current form. They've been watching all along." The lunar altars, scattered across the constant, 3 massive altars began to emerge from the ground, or perhaps they'd always been there, merely hidden until the moon's fall made them relevant. Each altar was different. The altar of the moonstone, the altar of the glass stone, the altar of the celestial sanctum. The survivors worked to complete them. gathering components, solving puzzles, channeling energies they didn't fully understand. It felt important, this work. It felt like it was leading somewhere. Charlie appeared several times during their efforts, her shadow form flickering in and out of perception. She took the tragic torch, a relic the survivors had acquired through solving another of the Constant's puzzles, to the lunar island. There, she held it aloft and somehow used it to draw in the gestalts, those lunar creatures that spawn from pure light. The torch burst into white flames. Through those flames, Charlie looked at the moon, and the moon looked back. Inside what they'd believed was a celestial satellite, the survivors saw the truth. A massive eye, unblinking, ancient, watching, always watching. When the 3 altars were finally completed, they activated, released what the puzzles had called mysterious energy, and triggered a response. The storm that followed was unlike anything the Constant had experienced. Lightning split the sky, thunder shook the ground, and in the chaos, the truth revealed itself. Altar the eye in the sky, the being the ancients had worshipped as a benevolent moon deity, was them, or at least one of them. It had been masquerading as a natural satellite, watching the Constant, influencing its inhabitants, playing a game whose rules and objectives remained mysterious. Now, exposed, it no longer bothered to hide. The celestial champion. From the sky descended a being of terrible beauty. The celestial champion, herald or avatar of Altar, came to defend against what it perceived as an attack. The survivors had built a device on top of the mysterious energy, attempting to harvest it, to understand it. The champion would not allow this. The battle was apocalyptic. The champion wielded lunar power as Maxwell once wielded shadow, but with far greater mastery. It could summon fused shadows, terrible hybrids of light and dark that attacked from all directions, could create barriers of crystallized moonlight, could rain destruction from above. But the survivors had learned much. They'd defeated the ancient fuel weaver. They'd conquered the forge and satisfied the gorge. They died and revived and learned and adapted through countless cycles of survival. Working together, they brought the champion down. In its death throes, it didn't speak, didn't curse them or explain itself. It simply ended, dissolved back into the lunar energy from which it had been formed, leaving behind fragments of impossible materials and more questions than answers. Wagstaff appeared then, Robert Wagstaff, the inventor who'd vanished in the 1919 factory fire, who'd been lost in his own explorations of the spaces between spaces. He'd been investigating the Constant from outside, studying its properties, attempting to understand its fundamental nature. Fascinating, he said, examining the aftermath. The moon altar is intrinsically linked to this dimension's inhabitants, influences them on a fundamental level. The ancients understood this, which is why they built the moonstone to draw power from it. But they didn't realize what they were really worshiping, didn't understand that Altar was one of them. So, what does that mean? Wilson asked, exhausted from the battle. Wagstaff adjusted his goggles, turned his eyeless gaze toward the survivors. It means you're pieces on a board, my dear fellow. The ancients were pieces. Maxwell was a piece. Charlie is a piece. The Nightmare Throne was built to channel them's influence, and the lunar structures serve the same purpose for Altar. The question is, are you content to be pieces? Or do you want to flip the board? Before anyone could answer, Wagstaff vanished, pulled back into whatever dimension he currently called home. The survivors were left standing in the storm, watching as the Constant reshaped itself once again around them. Charlie's gambit. In the throne room, Charlie sat in contemplation. Her two selves, the human and the monster, had merged now into something new, something that was neither quite one nor quite the other. Queen Charlie, some of the survivors, had taken to calling her ruler of the Constant. Whether she wanted the title or not, she could feel them watching, could feel Altar's enormous eye turn toward the Constant with renewed interest, could sense the ancient patterns reasserting themselves, the cycles that had destroyed the bug people, threatening to destroy the humans as well. But Charlie had advantages the ancients hadn't possessed. She'd been human once, understood human nature, human stubbornness, human creativity in the face of impossible odds, and she had access to both shadow and lunar magic, could theoretically balance one against the other. The question was, should she? Helping the survivors might anger them, might bring down consequences she couldn't predict. But leaving them to struggle alone seemed cruel. And despite her monstrous aspects, Charlie retained enough humanity to balk at unnecessary cruelty. So she compromised. She altered the floored postern, improved it, made it more stable, allowed more survivors to arrive, each one another piece on the board, another potential agent of change. She scattered hints across the constant, the tragic torch, the puzzles that revealed fragments of the true history, the structures that pointed toward deeper secrets. She was, in her way, arming them, giving them the tools they'd need to make their own choices. In the ancient archive, Charlie and two shadow creatures examined ancient murals, the story of Methius, the sacrifice, the throne. All of it was there, carved in stone, waiting to be understood. They think it's about survival, Charlie whispered to the shadows. They think if they just adapt enough, gather enough resources, build strong enough bases, they'll be safe. But it was never about survival. It was always about choices, about whether you become the monster the constant wants you to be, or whether you find another way. The shadow creatures offered no response. But in the throne room, the nightmare throne pulsed with ancient power, waiting, always waiting for the next fool, for the next sacrifice, for the next turn of the wheel. The shipwrecked world, somewhere in the space between spaces, connected to the constant by pathways known to very few, existed another realm. A tropical archipelago where survivors occasionally found themselves washed ashore, victims of shipwrecks both mundane and magical. This was one of Maxwell's experiments, created during his time on the throne. A place where the rules differed, where survival meant mastering the seas rather than the forests, where hurricanes and volcanoes replaced winter and summer as primary threats. It was meant to be a variation, a different kind of test. But like all of Maxwell's creations, it took on a life of its own once Charlie claimed the throne. The tiger shark that patrolled those waters bore a resemblance to Charlie, perhaps Maxwell's subconscious guilt manifesting, or perhaps just coincidence. Other creatures there seemed designed to torment in ways Maxwell himself might have enjoyed. Before he understood the true nature of his prison, the survivors who found themselves in shipwreck adapted as survivors do, built boats and bases, learned to navigate by stars and currents, discovered which foods prevented scurvy and which caused it. They found seaworthy devices that could transport them back to the main constant, connecting the tropical realm to the primary world. But Shipwrecked remained largely separate from the main story. A side venture, a different kind of nightmare. Those who entered it faced unique challenges, but ultimately served the same purpose, feeding them's inscrutable designs, adding complexity to a system that seemed designed to generate and sustain suffering. Or perhaps, and this is merely speculation, it served another purpose, a refuge, a place where the primary conflicts playing out in the constant proper were muted, where one could focus on simpler survival rather than cosmic conspiracies and ancient curses. If so, it was a kindness, an unexpected mercy in a realm not known for mercy. Whether that kindness was intentional or accidental, only Charlie could say. And Charlie, seated on her throne, kept her own counsel. The cycle continues. The survivors continue their endless struggle, dying and resurrecting, learning and adapting. More arrive through the floored postern regularly now. Walter with his stories and slingshot, Wirt from her merm colony, others whose tales are still being written. Charlie maintains her vigil on the nightmare throne, balancing shadow and light, trying to protect her prisoners while serving her own mysterious purposes. She visits the lunar island occasionally, studies the ancient archive, and contemplates the murals depicting Methius's sacrifice. Is she planning to repeat that sacrifice, to free herself and the survivors at the cost of her own existence? Or has she found another way, a third option that the ancient civilization never considered? The survivors don't know, can't know, can only continue forward one day at a time, one season at a time, gathering resources and knowledge in equal measure. Maxwell walks among them now, no longer the puppet master, but merely another victim. He shares what he knows, the limits of the throne's power, the nature of them, the patterns he observed during his long imprisonment. Whether the others trust him is unclear, but they listen, because in the constant, knowledge is survival. Wilson has become something of a leader, though he never sought the role. His scientific mind helps organize their research, categorizes their discoveries. He studies the lunar structures with the same intensity he once applied to his laboratory experiments. Somewhere in the constant's rules and exceptions, he believes, lies the key to freedom, if such a key exists. Meanwhile, in places beyond the constant, in dimensions adjacent and parallel, other events unfold. Wagstaff continues his investigations, mapping the boundaries between worlds. The Forge and the Gorge persist, their inhabitants unaware that they're part of a larger pattern. And in the wreckage of the Voxola factory, Winona's portal, broken but not destroyed, occasionally flickers to life, pulling in new victims or offering brief glimpses of home to those lost in the between spaces. Them watch all of it. Alter's great eye turns its gaze across the constant, missing nothing. The shadow entities lurk at the edges of sanity, ready to manifest when madness takes hold. The ancient patterns reassert themselves, cycle after cycle, prisoner after prisoner. But here's the thing about cycles. They can be broken. The ancient civilization fell, yes. But they also left behind knowledge carved in stone, encoded in structures, preserved in the very fabric of the constant itself. Metheus sacrificed herself, but her torch remains, lighting the way for those who come after. Maxwell was trapped, but Wilson freed him. Wilson was trapped, but Charlie freed him. Charlie is trapped now, but she's also the trap simultaneously, prisoner and warden, victim and architect. It's a paradox, a puzzle, a knot that seems impossible to untangle. But the survivors are nothing if not persistent. They've learned to farm beefalo and build lightning rods. They've mapped the caves and defeated the fuel weaver. They've sailed to the moon and brought down its champion. Each impossible challenge overcome, each certainty questioned, each rule bent if not quite broken. Perhaps that's the point. Perhaps them don't care if the survivors eventually escape. Perhaps the struggle itself is the purpose-generating experiences, testing variables, running an experiment that spans civilizations and dimensions. Or perhaps them are as trapped as everyone else, locked into patterns they established so long ago that even they've forgotten why. Perhaps the Nightmare Throne binds its creators as surely as it binds its occupants. These are the questions the survivors ask themselves on long nights around the campfire, when the darkness presses close and Charlie prowls invisible beyond the light's reach. Questions without answers. Mysteries wrapped in enigmas, wrapped in nightmares. But they ask anyway. And in the asking, they remain human, remain themselves, remain something more than mere pieces on them's game board. The constant endures, the cycle continues. And in the throne room, Charlie smiles, human and monster, shadow and light, prisoner and queen, and wonders if this time, finally, someone will find a way to end the game. Or if the game has already ended and everyone simply forgot to stop playing. In the constant, the line between ending and beginning blurs like the line between shadow and light. Each death is a resurrection. Each sunset promises sunrise. Each autumn leads to winter, leads to spring, leads to summer, leads to autumn again. Maxwell sits on his throne no longer, but the throne remembers him. Wilson freed himself, but the freedom is questionable. Charlie rules, but her rule is servitude. The survivors survive, but survival in the constant is just another word for imprisonment. And that brings us to the end of the Don't Starve timeline. If you enjoyed this quiet journey through its story, leaving a like really helps the channel, and subscribing means you won't miss the next timeline we explore.